All right, I was just turning on the mic.
Yeah, I'm going to take it. I think it should be on.
It is. I turned it on at the wall. There we go. Okay.
You want me to start at 2:30 or 2:45?
2:30. I do just a really quick intro to thank people, and then. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final Iowa Files for 2024-25. There's always troublemakers in the front who keep talking, but we love them anyway. That's all right. I'm Gail Brubaker. I'm the Executive Director for the West Des Moines Historical Society. I want to thank you for coming and being so supportive. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation today. Kind of difficult to hear, but it's something that I really know very little about, so I'm very much looking forward to Erica's presentation. This is sponsored by the West Des Moines Library, the Friends Foundation of the West Des Moines Library, and our donors and members. So if you have enjoyed these series, if you have any ideas for topics you would like to see, or an extra dollar bill or two burning a hole in your pocket, there's information there in the back about how you can support and help us keep providing this free educational series through your ideas and your donations. So, very little further ado, Erica Spiller.
Thank you, Gail. And on that note, have any of you been to the Jordan House recently, within the last couple of years? Okay, if you haven't, or if it's been a while, make that the next stop on your list. Gail, Kelly, and the whole team have done incredible things at the Jordan House, and you need to make sure you check it out. All right, as Gail mentioned, I'm Erica Spiller. I want to tell you up front, I wrote this book 4 years ago, and it is amazing how many little teeny tiny factoids you can forget in all those short years. So if I refer to my notes more than usual, that's why. So this is the book. If anybody has read it and has questions along the way, or just has questions along the way, stop, shout them out. I'm happy to answer those in the moment. Sometimes it's hard to remember them all the way at the end. Before I get started, I do want to share, as Gail mentioned, there are some difficult topics in here. So some trigger warnings for you. I am going to talk about racial profiling and discrimination. I'm going to talk about prejudice, misgendering, forced outing, self-harm, abuse, addiction, violence, death, ableism, and female oppression. If you read the blurb, I'm guessing you knew some of these things might come up, but just in case if any of these topics do make you uncomfortable, please feel free to take care of yourself and leave the room. I want to start with some facts about incarcerated women today, and these facts represent women across the country. So first off, the ACLU has identified women as the fastest growing segment of the incarcerated population. You're going to hear a little bit about why that is in the presentation. 4% of the world's female population lives in the United States, yet a third of worldwide incarcerated women are here in the US. The men's population is 5 times the size it was in 1978. The women's population, 9 times. 2/3 of incarcerated women are women of color, and the incarceration rates of black women grew by 800% between 1986 and 1997. Overall, the rate of incarcerated women between 1980 and 2019 grew by 700%. Finally, between 2009 and 2015, men's incarceration rates actually fell by 5%, whereas women's rates fell by only 0.29%. Throughout this presentation, some of this will start to click, and we'll revisit this again at the end. This is one of my favorite quotes that I came across while I was doing research. I know it's a little small, so I'll read it to you. This is from Marie Carter. She was the superintendent of the Iowa Training School for Girls, and she wrote this in 1954 when she was presenting to United States Congress on juvenile delinquency. And she said, "I think it is well understood that an institution is pitted against failure almost from the beginning. When the child comes into the institution, they are confronted with that. There is no doubt about it that any child, regardless of how well the job may have been done, will leave the institution with an institutional stigma because of the lack of education and understanding on the part of society as a whole. I hope there will come a day when institutions will not be needed. It is expensive. They do the best they can under the circumstances, but the job probably could be done just as well, and certainly far less expensively, if it could be done in a local community by the local probation workers and social workers and police force and churches and schools. So why women? Why write this book about the correctional history in the state of Iowa, focusing on women? So I get the question a lot, what made you write this book? What happened that inspired you to write this book? So it was sort of a right time, right place passion, and I happened to be an English major. So I was working as a composition chair for an academic institution, and former colleague and friend in the back there worked in that same institution, and I just happened to sit next to our criminal justice chair. So she was a contributor on the book, Peggy Long, Peg Maines. So I would go with her anytime we'd take students on tours of the correctional institutions. And when we were at ICIW, or Mitchellville, I learned that they were going to be demolishing that facility. As someone with a love of history, I asked the warden at the time, Patty Walkendorf, if they would maybe preserve one of the buildings or make a little museum or something. And her answer was no, the plans are to flatten the facility. So then I asked, okay, can I write a book on the history of this site? And you'll learn why later. There's a rich history of this site. And she said absolutely. So Patty and her assistant Emily loaded up the trunk of my SUV with totes of case files and court transcripts and photos and you name it. And when Peg and I started doing research, we said, okay, we found the women in 1982, but where were they before that? And we couldn't find it anywhere. Looked on the internet, I don't know where they were. So after a long time of trying to figure out how are we going to find where these women came from, I don't remember how, we finally made our way down to the state capitol, to the library, on the second floor, where a man named Corey was nice enough to actually let us walk up those stairs that you never get to go up. And we spent days and hours in those rooms reading through the biennial reports of state institutions that the wardens used to have to turn in back in the mid-19th century, and we finally found the first woman. And we realized the history doesn't exist. When you ask the question, where were women before 1982, that didn't exist. It wasn't really comprehensively documented anywhere. So then we figured, okay, I guess we got to write the whole thing. So that's why we wrote this comprehensive book on the history of women. But the other reason for this is one of the things that I'm very passionate about when I write books is making sure that we tell the stories that haven't been told. Or, more importantly, the stories that were suppressed, the stories that were buried. There are tons and tons of books on the history of the correctional system as it impacted men. And take it out of the scope of the correctional system. There are tons and tons of books about men, about all sorts of other individuals. Not always do we get a comprehensive history of women. I'm also going to talk about some of the LGBTQ experiences in prison. Those are voices that are often underrepresented as well. So trying to elevate those voices. A couple pictures you're seeing here in case you're curious. Up on the right, those are some of the girls at the Girls Industrial School at the old Mitchellville site. Down here on the left, that's in Rockwell City, one of the sewing rooms. And you'll notice something I'll talk about later, they actually got to wear a lot of their own clothes when they were in Rockwell City. Like I mentioned, a lot of the women, we don't know their stories. So I'm going to tell a few of them today. There's more of them in the book. And if anyone's interested in more specific stories, let me know. I can refer you to a number of other books as well. Because we don't know a lot about them, because there's not a lot available, there were some research challenges in writing this book. A lot of primary material, very few people to talk to from some of these eras. And sometimes the information we have isn't necessarily reliable. Also, newspapers at the time tended to record people's names as a first initial and a last name, so you didn't always know if it was a female or a male that was mentioned in the newspaper. So there were plenty of times where we'd take this piece of evidence and this piece of evidence, and it's A. Hauer, and this is Anna Hauer. Could that be? Same crime, same time. This must be who it was. again, more evidence of we don't have as much of their information, as much of their history. This is the band at the girls' school in Mitchellville. As I mentioned, the stories of some of our LGBTQ incarcerated individuals were not always documented as well. In fact, in all of our research, going back further than modern times, we only found one example. What you're seeing here, this was the very official register that they used when they booked people into the facility. You can see these all online if you Google that consecutive register of convicts, they called them at the time, and you can read through there, their names, their charges. Up here, the third one down, and you can see the red font below it, this is Charles Miller. Charles Miller was arrested for stealing a horse. When Charles Miller was arrested, he'd been living with his wife and their young daughter. And he was sent to Fort Madison. And when Charles was in Fort Madison, he got sick. And he refused treatment from the physician there. Eventually, Charles got sick enough that he passed out. And when the physician went to try and rouse him, removed Charles's shirt and discovered that Charles was born a woman, had been living as a man in Fort Madison. So that line underneath there in red, if you can see it or if you can, it says transferred from Fort Madison. Once they figured out Charles was born a female, they transferred Charles to Anamosa at that time. So these are the facilities that we're going to talk about today. And we are going to do a little time hopping, so I hope you brought your time machine with you. Top one is Fort Madison. You're seeing a picture of the warden's house. The second one here is Anamosa. If you ever want to see any of these, Fort Madison is no longer there in all of its glory. I think there might be some pieces, but most of it is gone. Anamosa is still there. The girls' school, this that you're seeing now, has been completely demolished. Down here is the Women's Reformatory, now a men's institution in Rockwell City. This was ICIW when adult women were in it. That was when it was minors. And then down here on the far right, that's one of the buildings in the current ICIW facility. So we're going to talk about these today. And we will start with Fort Madison. So as many of you probably know, this was a military fort. Eventually abandoned. Like I said, it's been a while, dates. So they abandoned it in 1813 because of a shortage of provisions. Iowa was still a territory at this time, and there were increasing cries for somewhere to house criminals. So eventually, and by eventually I mean 26 odd years later, they built the Fort Madison Penitentiary about a mile north of where this fort was. When they built the penitentiary, the men were actually kept in the warden's cellar, and they would open that up during the day, they would come out and they would build their own prison, and then at night they would go back into the cellar. The women, once we found the first woman, 1855, the reports were biennial, so it was maybe 1855, 1856, we're not sure. That's when we find the first woman. She was kept in the warden's attic, and that is where women would stay in the Fort Madison Penitentiary the entire time that they were there. So we don't know much about her other than she was there, lived with the warden's family. At some point, we saw in the record that there was a baby born in the facility. That baby was also allowed to live in the attic. And it might surprise you that they didn't just stay in the attic. They worked for the warden and the family. Cooked meals, served meals, may have done mending, washing, those kinds of things. We don't start to get many more details about the women until about 30 years later. We sort of just know they're there. And if you ever want to read these reports, they're fascinating. These first 20 years or so of reports, now when we see them, they're very statistical. This many people, here's the demographics. These were like stories. They would tell stories about the people that were there, what it was like. I've seen more menus than I've seen information about amounts of people or what they were doing or programming and things like that. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This is my favorite picture. I've spent a lot of time with some people at the State Historical Society. We think this is the only photo that has a female in it. Charles Miller, probably not, because I think we can tell. So later, if you want me to pull this up, you're welcome to come up here and see if you think you can find the female in this photo. So this is a photo of inside Fort Madison. In the back, cover your eyes, they're all naked, they're lined up to go into the shower, and in the front, they're starting to line up here the other way. So the first women that were here, we know very little about, but this is where we start to see the different trends in why women are incarcerated. So the women who are sent here are primarily sent here for things like murder, or attempted murder, trying to poison a husband, maybe poisoning a spouse to take another lover. So a few of them that we run into, Lena Stanton, hers was actually horse thieving. This was the other big thing. Either you were murdering someone or you were stealing someone's horse. Those were like the two major things that would land you in prison. So, yeah. So Lena Stanton stole a horse and a carriage, so double whammy there. She was 17 and she was pregnant when she was arrested, delivered the baby in jail. She may have been the one that we read about, kept the baby there, but we're not sure. The governor pardoned her, and if you're wondering why, back then we don't have this great probation and parole type system. We're still sort of that patronage, Tammany Hall type situation where ultimately someone said, yeah, she's got a good place to go, just let her go, it's fine. So she leaves shortly after. Anna Hauer is there in 1881. She allegedly poisoned her husband, later is transferred to another facility where she escapes, and we lose the trail on her at that point. Elizabeth Porter is another one we run into here. She was a victim of domestic abuse, and this is a theme that will come up throughout the presentation. After years and years of abuse, actually her son killed the father. She knew about it, did not turn her son in, and so both of them were sent to prison. They both received 21-year sentences. If you're wondering why the person who did the murdering and hid the murdering got the same sentence, we have cases even today where there is a woman sitting in ICIW who did not actually do the crime and is still in prison, and the gentleman who did has been out for, I think, decades. So that still happens today. Anna Taylor was another one. This is the one she conspired with her lover to kill the wife, and a really good idea after that happened, they got married the next day. And so people kind of figured out what happened there, and Anna went to prison. So eventually, Iowa keeps growing. We needed a second prison, and the state decided they wanted a location that could be financially useful. So they selected Anamosa with the rock quarry. This is an image you can see at the time they were called convicts. We don't call them that anymore, but you can see the men operating the equipment and once again building their own prison. This was sort of the theme back there as well, or back then as well. This is 1873. They transferred 20 men from the rock quarry to start work on the prison. And it's not until a couple of years later that we find the first female there. And then shortly after that, they transfer the rest. So we think the first few came in maybe because they were booked straight into there once they were arrested. Then about 9 or so years later, we think that's when they transferred any that were in Fort Madison over to Anamosa. At the time, Anamosa is just one building. It's not the sort of complex it is today, which means the women were kept in one room. They didn't get to go outside because they didn't want the men to see them. So they stayed in here all day, every day, would maybe do some washing, mending. You can see the sewing machines there, but that was about the extent of their day. They were really on constant lockdown. This is a different building they were in, so the situation improved for women when they moved them from that tiny room into the building where they kept the men that were considered mentally ill. So, yet again, they're on lockdown. They didn't want them to be around the men, so they stay in here 24/7. This was at the time called, quote, the insane department. So that is where they moved women once they moved them out of their initial accommodation in Anamosa. And then finally, this is almost 30 years after they move women to Anamosa, they finally get their first building called the female department. So, first woman we find in history comes in 1855. We are 1902 before women get something other than the warden's attic or a small cell house within a men's building. So around this time, 20 women. So the population may have had something to do with it. There weren't a ton of women in the correctional system at that time. But lo and behold, once they had their own building, that population doubled. So now that we have a place to put them, we'll start sending them there. The trends, however, during this time start to change. We still have people in there for homicide and things like that. However, now we're starting to see crimes that are against public decency. So if I read down this list, these are women in this list: larceny, prostitution, forgery, prostitution, lewdness, keeping a house of ill fame, running a brothel, lewdness, delinquent, incorrigible, prostitution. So this is what we are sending women, and there are some minors in here as well, at this time. Do you think the men's list looks like that? No, it doesn't. Very, very little of that. In fact, we ran into multiple scenarios where women and men would be caught together. The woman would go to prison, the man would go home. Ran into that quite a bit, especially during this era. And you can see here some transfers as well. There's one of them on here. It might be a different picture. One of these we run into, you actually see some minors that are sent over. So I think it's these two right here. You can see that Red Riding transferred from Mitchellville. When they were in the girls' school, if they didn't finish their programming before they hit the age of majority, they would transfer them to Anamosa. Or if they did something very, very naughty, they would transfer them to Anamosa as well. You can see the top 4 there. Those were some of the 4 that were transferred to Anamosa once that site was ready for them. So some stats when I talked about those public decency crimes: 50% of the women who were incarcerated at the time were incarcerated for these crimes against public decency. 19% of men had that as the charge they were in for. One of the things that we also found interesting working on this section, most of the time the women were married. There was almost no evidence of drug or alcohol abuse with women who were incarcerated, and they were really intelligent. In fact, the warden at the time, we found a quote from him that he deduced women must be mentally stronger than men because they were really so impressive coming into the facility and not having issues outside of whatever this was that they had done. One of the more famous, if you will, inhabitants in Anamosa was Margaret Hosek. Has anybody heard of her before? She's considered the Lizzie Borden of Iowa. Margaret is sitting here with John, her husband. These are all their kids. Margaret and John and the family lived in what is Indianola now. And there's a fascinating book. The two down here, Patricia and Thomas, wrote the book, Midnight Assassin, I think is what it's called, that goes over this whole thing. So she was accused of killing her husband. In hindsight, we don't think that's what happened. We think most likely one of her sons killed her husband. Whether or not she knew about it, hard to say. But here's the thing at the time. Guess how many women were on the jury? None. In fact, one of the reporters at the time who worked for the Register was Susan Glaspel. And so this Hosek trial actually was one of the things that inspired her to write A Jury of Her Peers and Trifles. So it's really fun to read this and read those and sort of see some of the things come together there. Again, as I mentioned, this is one of these domestic abuse themes. Years and years of severe domestic abuse. Commentary of how weathered and worn and beat down she was after all of this. And again, likely another case where one of the children actually did this. I won't spoil the whole book, but it is Midnight Assassin if you want to read more about that. So after this era, we start to move into the reform movement in the correction system. And of course, we're not thinking about the reform movement for women. We're thinking about the reform movement for men. We'll figure out if women get to do that too later. So in 1907, Anamosa is renamed the Iowa State Reformatory. And the warden at the time, McClary, he wanted the women out of there because he needed to focus on reforming the men, and they were a distraction. This is his words, not mine. So he needed to get the women out of there so the men could have a chance at reform. 9 years later, they would get that chance. Put a pin in that. We're going to jump in time, and we're going to talk about the girls' reform school. So in the book, I don't follow juveniles through some of the other places that they went, just so you're aware. Toledo, but their presence at the girls' reform school, which is in the same location as ICIW or Mitchellville, is long enough, it is important enough that it is included in this book. So we're going to take this side journey and talk about the girls' reform school. So this is the little archway into the school. Anybody want to guess where the girls lived in the beginning? I heard it. Who said it? The attic. Yet again, we put the girls in the attic. So Superintendent McCarty was one of the first there, and the girls live in his attic because at the time it started as a co-ed school. So there were plenty of boys, and we just threw the girls in the attic. Eventually, he refused to take any more females because there wasn't room. So the legislature ordered him to do that. So he said, fine, I'm going to put him in the same building with the boys. Well, that's not decent. So then the legislature changed their mind, and they moved the boys to Eldora, where there is still a boys' facility. Before it was the girls' school, this started off as Thomas Mitchell's seminary. Going back a little bit before that, there had been a manual labor camp in Mount Pleasant, sort of long tangential backstory, but lost some land. In the meantime, Thomas Mitchell had tried to start the seminary. It didn't go well. He couldn't really get enough people to make it work, couldn't really fund it, so he offered to sell it to the state. And they were having issues keeping the land down in Mount Pleasant, so they said, yes, we'll buy this. So that's how the juvenile system gets to Mitchellville, where we're going to talk about it there. So 1880, this is when the girls start to be held here, and this is one of the primary buildings. So the Llewellings were the superintendents who were probably there the longest, Mr. and Mrs. Llewelling. And they had a three-phased system of education. This is a picture of their domestic sciences. So one of the things the girls had to do while they were there was master their domestic sciences. They also had schooling, the typical subjects, and then religious instruction. So if one of the inhabitants mastered all three of those things, they could be released. Otherwise, they would stay there until they reached the age of majority. If they'd done enough, if they weren't a risk, then they could leave. I believe at the time that was 21. So they would stay there. They would not be sentenced for a certain amount of time like they are today. It's until you become a functional person in their eyes, and then you can go. The themes here in the girls' school are a little bit different than the themes with the adult women that are incarcerated. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people coming here because of extreme poverty, because of abuse. A few things that we ran into. So about 50% were European immigrants or African Americans, and we can get into a side lecture about why that is. 93% were incarcerated for incorrigibility, vagrancy, larceny, disorderly conduct, or prostitution, but here's the caveat on those. What actually happened maybe wasn't that clear. So when we would run into these stories, there's I forget his name off the top of my head. He's got a pretty decent book on some of the individuals that were incarcerated in the girls' school. Here's one example. Her name was Anna. She was a German immigrant, and she and her mother came over because her father had joined the military. When they got here, unfortunately, her mother passed away. So now Anna's alone in the U.S. because they still haven't found the father. Unfortunately, Anna's raped, and Anna becomes pregnant. She delivered the baby alone in an outbuilding as a child. She was sick, she was weak, and she did take the life of her child. This is the type of scenario that we run into. We've got another one we run into named Mary Lou. She was living with her mother in the poorhouse. Well, kids aren't allowed to stay in the poorhouse. So when her mother passed away, Mary Lou goes to the girls' school. We also ran into a number of cases where there was abuse at home. And the only way the mother or the aunt or whoever could get their daughter out of the abusive situation was to say they were incorrigible so that they could get them to safety at the girls' school. Unfortunately, there were far more of those scenarios than any of us would want to imagine. Another picture from a Halloween party at the girls' industrial school. It went through a few different name changes. So they moved it from the training school in 1918 to the industrial school. At this time, it has 6 cottages, and by 1950, the population is at 100. They have a gymnasium, classrooms, library, stage, and an admin building. Anybody ever go to ICIW when the adult women were there? I know you have. You've been through some of those buildings if you have. They were still standing, and those are the buildings they moved the women into later. Around the 1970s, the legislature starts calling for that facility for girls to be closed because they want them to transfer them to Toledo. They don't think we should have 2 institutions for females. They want to move boys there, yet again, so they want to move the girls to Toledo. In 1982, they finally do that. In 2014, Toledo is closed. Things have not gotten better. As of today, we do not have a female juvenile facility in the state of Iowa. So if a female juvenile is convicted, other than Polk County Jail or something like that, or unless there's some sort of private organization, they're going out of state. So we've not necessarily improved in this regard. This is another picture of the facility. This one was kind of cute when I don't know if cute's the right word, when we ran into this, the X that's up there, this was one of the girls that was there, wrote a postcard to her family and said, "This is my room." Came across that. Okay, now we're jumping back to the grown-up women again. This is the Rockwell City Reformatory. This building is still standing. Men are there now. Again, needed more room for men. Get the women out of there so you can get the men where they need to go. No offense to men in the room. This is just how the state rolled at the time. So 22 women were transferred here in 1918 from Anamosa. This is, again, so Warden McClary could work on reforming the men. They did finally move the women to their first entire institution. So this is the first time that women have their own institution, and it is reformatory at Rockwell City. It has an admin building. When they start, it has 1 cottage, a powerhouse, an industrial building, a schoolhouse, and it has 200 acres. They do a lot of gardening, recreation, all those sorts of things. Eventually, we get up to 51 women in confinement here. 84% are white, 16% are black. Very different than the general population in the state of Iowa. These not so subtle hints that I'm dropping here is really about how we as a state and an institution treated the residents, not necessarily what the residents were doing. Most of the women incarcerated here were between 15 to 25 years old at the time. We had education and training here as well, writing, spelling, shorthand, farming, and domestic training. There were no fences or bars at this institution. The women could have personal items. They could bring their own clothes, their own bedding, and the language here, they were not called convicts. They were called clients. They were called girls, and they didn't even call it the Rockwell Reformatory. They called it Lanedale. They could leave Lanedale to go to church. They could come and go to town as they pleased. Their family could come and visit them. In fact, when we were interviewing, so there are two, I don't know if there's still three, I'm looking at the corrections expert in the room. There are at least two women still in ICIW who lived at Rockwell City. And when we were interviewing them for this book, they were going through the transition of having been at the original Mitchellville ICIW facility, which even if you've seen pictures, it looked like a college campus. Beautiful brick buildings, big trees, walkways, tons of grass, flowers, some privacy in the rooms, even if they were overcrowded. Well, when they built the new facility is hyper-industrial. It's kind of got this Foucault's panopticon. Everybody can see you and see everything you're doing. It's very clinical feeling. And we could tell those women who had gone from your own clothes, your own bedding, to at least some privacy and at least a pretty environment to this really hyper-sterile type environment, you could tell it was impacting them. So we actually stepped away from those interviews for a couple of years, let them settle into the new facility, and worked on other aspects of the book before we came back and talked to them. At this time, once again, crimes have shifted. We're now in the 1950s, 1960s, and now we've moved away from crimes against public decency to paper crimes. 80% of the women incarcerated in 1962 are incarcerated for forgery. We have a lot of these kinds of crimes. We also start to see a really interesting perception of women's prisons. So that's one of the superintendents there. And these are some of the staff. When you read articles about Elda Kiles, who's there, about Laurel Rands, who's the superintendent after Elda Kiles, I kid you not, in the Des Moines Register and other papers, you will see things about the new attractive warden of the women's reformatory. Almost all of them. I still haven't come across any articles that talked about how attractive the men's wardens were at any of their facilities. And it was, as you might imagine, all these, oh, it's hard to believe a woman who's dressed so well and presents so nicely would want to go in a prison and do all these things. Again, even now into the 60s, no fences, no armed staff. The quote from Rands, one of the superintendents in the 60s, said, "We need no protection. If a girl ever attacked any employee, she would have all the other girls on her immediately. We care about each other." Now, it doesn't mean life was great at the reformatory, right? We're still in a reformatory. And one of the challenges, which remains a challenge in the state, it's far away. It's not super close. And a lot of these women have kids. They have families. So the ability for them to visit is limited. It's also really limited for any work release opportunities. It's way too far to get them to the city to try and make any improvements there. And then, no surprise, in the 70s, once again, we just need more space for men. We're going to have to take this facility. So the state starts looking around. Again, we've moved the female juveniles to Toledo, so they realize, okay, let's move the women there, which does move them closer to central Iowa and some more opportunities. So in 1982, we do move the women to ICIW. Here's some of the quotes at that time from some of our state representatives. These are both from Joan Lipsky. This is in response to the legislative proposal to close, at one point, all the female facilities to make room for men. Representative Lipsky said, "You'd put the women any damn place you want and then worry about the men. You can't believe the women of Iowa will stand still for that kind of a program. And then she said, I take great offense to the Higgins plan. Its main concern is finding a place to house male inmates and doesn't show any compassion for the women at all. I wouldn't oppose a change if a better alternative were proposed, but to suggest just sticking the women any old place in order to solve the men's problem is certainly wrong. I shouldn't really be surprised, though. That's the role women usually find themselves in. But then they do move here. This is Building 5, or was Building 5 of ICIW. These are the buildings that would have been standing when the girls were in them, and then the women were in these until 2000, when did they demo this? 2015, 16, they demoed them at different times, so this one's not there. Still, this is one of the facts people tend not to believe. No fence. Anyone want to guess what year the first fence went up around ICIW for women? 1994. Women do not have a fence around their institution until 1994. I mean, they had a 4-foot fence when they got there, but that was mainly to keep people out rather than the women from going. And even at that time, the women could come into town and go to the mall, into Des Moines and go to the mall. They could go to the movie theaters. They could still come and go from the facility. I think they would go swimming. So there weren't a whole lot of renovations that had been done. They sort of just moved into the facility where the girls had been, and there were around 60 women at the time. One of the perks of this move was that there were more work release opportunities. A lot of them were closer to family and could have more visits. These are some pictures inside the old ICIW. I know I say that acronym a lot. That's the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women. At the time, 57% are now in here for property offenses, theft, larceny, etc. 30% violent offenses. However, with violent offenses, consider the length of stay. They're going to be there longer, so that population is going to build up over time. 10% for drug offenses. Here's really where we start to see those drug offenses come into the picture. They would work 36 hours a week, cleaning, meal prep, bindery, adult basic education through one of the best community colleges in the nation, Des Moines Area Community College. I worked there. Eventually, more than 50% have a history of substance abuse. 71% are mothers at this time.
What year are you talking about?
This is when they moved, 1982, and the first few years after that. Treatment and programming. This is the gym that was in that facility. There's a stage up there as well. So by 1985 now, a few years after they move, 85% of the women in ICIW are identified as having substance abuse challenges. So we've seen over all these years how these trends in incarceration have changed. And now the population is skyrocketing. Connection with war on drugs here again, that's another mini lecture. 1989, we'd had 163 women, 1989. 2007, over 600. Again, what's going on? War on drugs, mandatory minimums. This is all leading to overcrowding, not just here, across the entire nation. There's also a lack of treatment for newer addictions. These drugs are taking hold nationally, and we don't know yet how to treat them, how to prevent them. And then this is limiting the beds and the facilities that we have for women. A lot of the programs are also contingent on volunteers. These aren't necessarily well-staffed institutions. They do rely heavily. There's some programs that people will come in, and I don't know if they still do it, but they did not too long ago, and record the women reading books for their kids. People who can come in and talk to them about counseling and those sorts of things. So in 1990, I said that was when we put in our first fence. It was also the first time a woman gets to be called warden at a correctional institution. The women's institution, they had always been called superintendents. They're finally called warden as well, over 100 years after the term had been in use for the leader of the men's institution. Finally, we moved to our current facility. This is the current ICIW facility. Again, you can see there's sort of the everyone can see you type appearance here, 2 to a room. Up in the right, that's general population, 4 sort of pods, 2 stories. That's the inside look on the lower right. Left over here is medical, it's the H unit, and there are some other buildings in there for programming and housing as well. The facility was mostly finished by 2013. It's what you'll see if you go there today. And you can see the stark difference from Rockwell City to this. Although the state is trying gender responsiveness, you can see some of the colors that are used in this, trying to convey a softer, gentler touch. So back to our facts that we started with at the beginning of the presentation. ACLU has identified women as the fastest growing segment of the incarcerated population. 4% of the world's female population lives in the US, even though a third of worldwide, a third of the incarcerated women are in the US. The men's population is 5 times the size it was in 1978. Women's is 9 times. 2/3 of incarcerated women are women of color, and the incarceration rates of black women grew by 800% between 1986 and 1997. Overall, the rate of incarcerated women between 1980 and 2019 grew by 700%. By 2009 and 2015, or between 2009 and 2015, men's incarceration rates fell by 5%, whereas women's rates fell by 0.29%. So I've spent a lot of time with this. The themes are really overt and obvious to me. I hope some of those are starting to reveal themselves to you in the influences on women's trends. Incarceration in the state of Iowa, many of which are national trends as well. That's the book. If anybody is interested in that, there's more information at my website at ericaspiller.com. 100% of the book royalties are donated to the DMAC education program for the women who are incarcerated at ICIW. And I'll take any questions.
On a lot of the increase in incarcerated women, is it related to the mandatory sentencing? That's one of the main factors that
That's a component of it.
guilty of more crimes.
Some of it shifts over time. I think we also start incarcerating people for things that, to Superintendent Carter's point, we probably could have assisted them with in the communities rather than sending them straight to prison. We also, there's this really interesting anthropological sort of tilt on it that we were never meant to live in societies this big. You lose that community influence when you live in smaller towns or, back when we didn't live in these major metropolitan areas. If Timmy did something wrong, the whole neighborhood knew Timmy did something wrong and Timmy didn't do it. That's not the case anymore. We also have all of these other influences and, not to get on a soapbox, but we don't really take care of our people. We don't have adequate mental health services. We don't have adequate services to keep people fed and keep them healthy. And so, then we've got our Jean Valjean scenario here where you got to eat, you got to make money, and if you can't do it in honest ways, you're going to do it in the ways that you can. When you meet these women that are incarcerated, when you talk to these women that are incarcerated, when you hear their stories, these are not people who woke up and said, I'm going to be bad today. The stories would horrify you. Not all of them, but and we do have someone who's worked in corrections for a long time here. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer questions later too, Abby. Women that were literally kept in dog kennels growing up. Women who, to be blunt, had a weapon pointed to the back of their head and said, do this or I'm going to do this to your kid. And I'm not saying that's all of them. Women who had severe mental illness. But guess what the state did? They closed down all the state institutions. So where do they put them? I'll never forget walking in the original ICIW facility, and it was the building 6, the max at the time, and the door slid open, and I looked at the 5 or 6 women that were sitting at the table, and I could see most of them had a disability. And I looked at the CO and said, what in the world? Minor crimes, minor drug crimes, things like this. There really is a huge environmental impact, and I'm a firm believer in the situation, the family that you're born into, and the opportunities you have are so influential, and there's so many people that are not born into those positive situations. Yeah.
Erica, I should have asked this earlier, but at one point you said that there were a lot of, I think 50% were public decency charges?
Yes.
What constituted public decency at that time?
That could be a range of things. Some of them we ran into, people getting caught engaging in sexual relationships in public. Those were the ones where you'd see the man not go to prison and the woman would. You'd see prostitution, keeping a house of ill fame. Those were some of the common ones that you might run into.
Okay, so that was all under, because in the ledger it had prostitution, decency, okay.
Yeah, lewdness was one of the terms that was sort of all-encompassing for them.
Topless or?
No, not necessarily. No, I'm sure that would have met the threshold, but not necessarily. Yep. Other questions? Gail?
So there were no attempts to escape when there wasn't a fence around, or is it not recorded?
From what we saw, pretty minimal. And in fact, it tended to happen, we saw more of that in the girls' school. I think part of it was you do that, you're going to be here a lot longer. And they didn't necessarily have as long of sentences, especially for some of these things, so I don't know that it was worth it. Just the guess based on what we found and what we didn't find. A lot of this we had to make inferences because there's not a lot of detailed information there. Yeah?
It's been a long time when there's been signs on Interstate 80 saying don't pick up hitchhikers by Metrobel.
Yes. Yep, you were right about that. Yeah.
Did you notice in your research the rate of reoffenders after the switch between having a more relaxed, community-driven vibe, I guess, of the facility to this really strict, harsh, we're watching you?
Yeah, I think you see the recidivism trends change with the opportunities that are offered. So when you have education, when you have training, when you have close community connections, you see those numbers decrease. And then, yeah, when you have this, massive people just floating through the machine and you don't necessarily get that level of engagement and that level of support, then you're going to see those trends go back up. Yeah, and in fact, the girls' school is probably where we got the most information on that. And the Llewellyns that I mentioned, they had the longest tenure there, and they really genuinely cared about, they called them their residents at the time, and very few of them came back. Very, very few, and that was mentioned by them. And that was a point of pride for them, was how few came back. Yeah?
You talked some about being staffed by volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
At what point was that again, and is that still the case?
There are still volunteers at ICIW, not for security or anything like that. The correctional officers, none of those kinds of things, but more programming. So volunteers, Abby may know more than I do, but a lot of religious or spiritual type programming, group type programs. There was even a group when they were in Rockwell that because their children were so far away, they would bring their kids back and forth to see them. So those kinds of things, if they were going to happen, it was going to be a volunteer group that would do those kinds of things. The state would really support we have to do it stuff. We have to keep the facilities safe, we have to keep people fed. Other than that, any extras really depend upon volunteers to do it.
You didn't talk about food unless maybe it was good for the women because they made their own.
The food at ICIW is great. It comes up all the time. Everybody seems to like the food there. I think at Rockwell, yeah, they farmed, they made their own. I don't know, it didn't come up a lot other than mentioning the farming and me just happening to hear from everyone that the food at ICIW is great. Men, on the other hand, I've seen a lot of menus. That seemed to be a point of pride for them at Fort Madison. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I'll hang around for a little bit, so if anybody has any other questions, you're more than welcome to ask.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much, Erica. So this is our last Iowa Files of this season. So I'll be working this summer to create the next set that will start next September. So if you have any requests, anything that you want to learn about, please get hold of me, and please mark your calendars for Saturday, October 11th. We are having our first, hopefully not last, Jordan House Heritage Jubilee. So this is going to be an opportunity with cultural experiences, live music, cider pressings. We're going to build a log cabin. There's going to be somebody there from the Raptor Rescue with a hawk, so you can learn more about our connected web of life. And it's going to be heritage games and crafts, including Farm Chore Olympics. So keep a lookout. We'll have more of that. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you this fall.